The rain had been falling since dawn, drumming against the rusted windows of the old Benton textile factory like 1,000 small fists. For years, the building had stood silent, a monument to a vanished era, its machines frozen in place as if still waiting for workers who would never are. That morning, the demolition crew moved carefully through the echoing halls, their boots crunching over shards of glass and forgotten bolts. The air smelled of wet concrete and dust, and then one of them saw it. At the far end of the second floor, behind a warped metal door, an office remained almost untouched, a locked room. Its frosted glass still bore the faded letters, Payroll Department. The doorknob was stiff, the lock rusted with time, but when they forced it open, the air that spilled out was heavy and stale as if it hadn't breathed. In decades, papers were stacked on the desk in neat piles. An old rotary phone sat silent, its cord curled like a sleeping snake. And in the corner, a tall gray filing cabinet leaned slightly, as though burdened with secrets too heavy to carry any longer. The men looked around, their voices low, almost respectful. This room felt different, preserved, not abandoned. Like someone had stepped out for lunch and never returned. A coat still hung on the rack by the door, its fabric brittle and thin. A pair of spectacles rested on top of a ledger book, lenses clouded with dust. Everything was in its place. Everything except the man who once sat there. His name was Harold Benton. In 1978, on a Friday evening just before Christmas, he walked out of this office after finishing the payroll for the week. He buttoned his overcoat, wished the night guard a good weekend, and vanished. No trace, no explanation, no goodbyes. For months they searched the factory floors, the riverbanks, the nearby woods, but nothing. Harold Benton became a ghost, a name that slipped into local legend and late-night whispers. Some said he ran off with the company's money. Others swore he'd met with something darker, something that fed on silence. Now, 47 years later, as the rain pounded the roof like an angry drum, this room had been opened again. And what waited inside would not only stir up an old mystery, it would change everything the town thought it knew about Harold Benton's last night on Earth. The foreman wiped the dust from his gloves and frowned. There was something else here, something the men hadn't noticed at first. At the far end of the office wall, behind the coat rack, the wallpaper bulged slightly, a ripple in the past, waiting to tear open. He didn't know it yet, but behind that wall, behind layers of cracked plaster and decades of quiet, there was a safe. A safe that had kept its mouth shut for nearly half a century, and when it finally opened, it would speak louder than Harold Benton ever did. Harold Benton was the kind of man people barely noticed, quiet, punctual, steady as the tick of a clock. He was 43 years old in the winter of 1978, a man of narrow routines and small comforts. Every morning he rose at 6:30 sharp, shaved with the same worn razor, and brewed his coffee in a dented percolator that hissed like a tired cat. He lived alone in a modest house 2 blocks from the textile mill, a white clapboard place with a sagging porch and a mailbox painted with his initial S in faded black. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. He nodded when spoken to, smiled just enough to seem courteous but never lingered for conversation. On Sundays, he attended service at St. Mary's, sitting in the third pew from the back, always alone. Afterward, he'd walk home with his hands in his coat pockets, the brim of his hat low over his brow, as if the world around him were something to pass through quietly rather than embrace. His life revolved around numbers, columns, sums, ledgers. Harold had a mind for order. At the factory office, he handled payroll with meticulous care, ensuring every dollar matched its name. Coworkers trusted him. Some even said the whole mill relied on Harold, because if the machines kept the fabric moving, Harold kept the people paid. He took pride in that, though he never boasted. He had no wife, no children. There were whispers, of course. Was there a sweetheart long ago? A broken engagement? No one knew for sure. His only living relative was an older sister in Ohio, and even she admitted they rarely spoke. Harold's world was the factory, the ledger, and the silent rhythm of his own routine, but if you looked closer, there were hints of something deeper. The way he lingered by the windows at dusk, staring out at the smokestacks bleeding into the sky. The way he kept his office so unnaturally neat, pens aligned, papers squared, drawers locked as if guarding more than stationery. And then there were the books. Old accounting manuals, yes, but tucked between them were things that didn't fit: volumes on labor disputes, corporate scandals, even a dog-eared novel about a man who vanished without warning. Those who worked with Harold recall small moments that seemed unremarkable then but unsettling now. Like the day he stopped by the cafeteria and ordered tea instead of his usual coffee, sitting alone with his hands clasped, staring at nothing. Or the time he asked a machinist about the loading docks, how late the gates stayed open, who had keys, whether the night guard checked every truck thaw. Tea left after hours. The machinist laughed, thinking it was idle curiosity. Harold smiled faintly, said nothing more, and walked away. He loved small things, though, tiny rituals that gave him peace. Every Friday after work, he'd visit the corner diner for a slice of apple pie. The waitress, a cheerful woman named Marjorie, remembered how he always left exact change and a folded dollar tip. "Thank you kindly, miss," he'd say in that soft, precise voice, then head out into the cold night with his collar turned up. No one ever saw him angry, no one ever saw him break, and yet in the weeks before he vanished, something shifted, just a fraction. A shadow in the eyes, a pause in the voice. It was as though Harold Benton, the man everyone thought they knew, was carrying a weight too heavy to share, a secret stitched so deep into his life. Had it would take nearly half a century and a wall giving way to a hidden safe for anyone to begin to understand. It began with small things. Things most people wouldn't notice or would shrug off as nothing. But with Harold, whose life was built on precision, those tiny shifts spoke louder than words. The first came in early November, just weeks before he vanished. Marjorie, the waitress at the diner, remembered it well. He came in late, almost closing time, his hat pulled low, his shoulders hunched against the wind. She expected his usual coffee, black, and apple pie, but he waved her off and asked for bourbon instead. She laughed at first, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. He sipped it slowly, eyes on the counter, and when he left, he didn't leave exact change. He left a $5 bill without a word. "Something about him felt heavy that night," she would say later, like a man carrying thunder in his chest. At the factory, he started locking his office door even during lunch breaks, something he had never done before. Harold wasn't the type to hoard secrets. His drawers were once as open as his ledgers, but suddenly everything was under lock and key. Papers that were once stacked openly now disappeared into the cabinet. A machinist named Don Lewis swore he saw Harold slip a thick envelope into the bottom drawer one afternoon. When Don joked about Harold hiding Christmas bonuses, Harold gave a stiff smile, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, and said, "Some numbers don't be long in the wrong hands." Then there was the night he stayed late, the last one in the building, long after the machines had gone silent. The night guard, Frank Holloway, recalled hearing footsteps echo through the empty halls around 11. When he checked, he found Harold in his office, the light dim, papers spread across the desk like fallen leaves. Frank asked if everything was all right. Harold looked up slowly, his eyes shadowed, and said, "Just making sure everything adds up." His voice was calm, but his hands, they were trembling. Rumors started to stir. Someone mentioned a phone call Harold received one morning, low voice, curt answers, and then silence. After that, he seemed jumpy, glancing at the window whenever a car pulled into the lot. Another worker claimed Harold had asked him about bus schedules, which was odd because Harold always walked to work. Then there was the stranger. A man in a gray overcoat seen waiting near the factory gates 2 nights in a row. He never spoke to anyone, never came inside. But some swore Harold saw him too, because on the second night Harold slipped out the back door instead of using the main entrance. One more detail lingered, whispered about years later: the ledger. Not the one everyone knew, the official payroll book, but another, slimmer volume Harold kept under his blotter. He wrote in it when he thought no one was looking, tight, cramped writing, figures, dates, initials. And once a line scrawled so deep it nearly tore the page. This cannot go on. What couldn't go on? No one asked, no one wanted to. But by then the air around Harold Benton had changed. It carried the scent of something unsettled, something closing in. And when the last Friday came, the one before Christmas, it would swallow him whole. The night Harold Benton disappeared was cold and raw, the kind of December evening where the wind slices through your coat and gnaws at your bones. Snow had started to fall by late afternoon, thin flurries that stuck to the cracked pavement outside the Benton textile factory. Inside, the building hummed with a fading energy. Most of the workers had already gone home, eager to escape the bitter air and the promise of another long winter weekend. By 7 o'clock, the machines were silent. The last of the looms had cooled, their steel frames dusted with lint like frost. In the office wing, a few lights glowed, lonely beacons in the empty dark. Harold was one of the last men there, hunched over his desk with the rigid posture of someone who needed everything perfect before he could leave. His coat hung neatly on the rack, his hat waited on the shelf, beside his ledger lay a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. Frank Holloway, the night guard, remembered passing Harold's door around 8. He gave a small wave and Harold, without looking up, lifted a hand in return. "Working late again?" Frank called. Harold's voice floated out, calm but clipped, "Just tying up the week." Nothing more, no smile, no goodnight. The clock on the wall ticked past 9, then 10. The snow outside thickened, dusting the factory windows in pale white. At 10:37, Frank was certain of the time because he checked his watch. He heard the door to the office wing close with a hollow thud. He looked up and saw Harold walking across the yard, his figure blurred by the falling snow, overcoat buttoned tight, hat pulled low. His steps were steady, unhurried, nothing about him seemed wrong, nothing at all. That was the last confirmed sighting. By the time Frank made his next round, the office was dark. Harold's desk was immaculate, papers squared, pen capped, chair tucked in as if waiting for the next morning. His coat and hat were gone, of course, but so was something else, his key ring, the one he always kept clipped to his belt. Outside, the snow swallowed his footprints within minutes. There were no tire tracks, no sign of a car waiting at the curb. Just an empty street and a night that kept its secrets well. The next morning, when Harold didn't show up for work, no one panicked. It was Christmas weekend, maybe he'd taken a trip, maybe he was visiting his sister in Ohio. But by Monday, when his house was found locked, his bed untouched, his toothbrush dry, the unease began to spread. Someone asked Frank again about that last glimpse, what Harold looked like, if he seemed troubled, if anyone else was with him. Frank shook his head every time. He was alone, he said, walking into the snow like he knew where he was going, but where was that? And why, after nearly half a century, does that image still feel like the beginning of something no one ever understood? Harold Benton didn't just leave his office that night, he stepped out of the world, and the world never got him back. The first search began before the snow had even stopped falling. On Monday morning, when Harold Benton failed to appear for work, his supervisor, Charles Whitman, called his house. No answer. By noon, concern had turned into a quiet sense of alarm. Harold wasn't the kind of man who skipped work without notice. He wasn't the kind of man who skipped anything. By evening, the factory floor was buzzing with whispers. A few employees drove by his home on Oak Street. The curtains were drawn, the porch light was off. His old Chevy was parked in the driveway, half buried in snow, no footprints on the walk, no signs of life inside. The police were called the next day. 2 officers arrived, their boots crunching in the snow as they circled the house. The locks were intact, no broken windows, no sign of forced entry. When they finally got inside, it was like stepping into a paused life. His bed was made, his clothes neatly hung in the closet, the kitchen spotless. A half-full bag of coffee beans sat on the counter. There was no suitcase missing, no sign of a hurried departure. Back at the factory, Charles led the officers to Harold's office. Everything looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. The desk was perfectly arranged, ledger books stacked, pens lined up. The calendar turned to Friday, December 22. There was no note, no clue. Just the eerie neatness of a man who left as if he intended to return. They searched the factory from top to bottom. The boiler room, the storage sheds, even the locked supply closets. Flashlights cut through the shadows, beams bouncing off rusted machines and steel pipes. The basement smelled of oil and damp earth. The men called Harold's name, their voices echoing into the dark, but the silence answered back every time dogs were brought in. Bloodhounds, their noses pressed to Harold's coat for scent. They pulled toward the loading docks, circled twice, then stopped cold, confused by the wind and the snow that had wiped everything clean. The river was dragged. For 3 days, men in heavy coats stood on the icy banks while divers plunged into the black water. Nothing surfaced. Not a glove, not a shoe, not even a scrap of cloth. Meanwhile, the town was alive with theories. Some said Harold had been kidnapped, though no ransom note ever came. Others whispered about money because payroll week meant cash was moving through the office. Was Harold carrying something he shouldn't have been? Or was someone else? His sister Margaret drove in from Ohio. She sat at his kitchen table, hands trembling as she turned over his coffee cup, as if the porcelain might whisper an answer. He wasn't the type to just leave, she told reporters, her voice thin and breaking. Harold was steady, predictable. If something happened, it wasn't by choice. For weeks, the search stretched on. Flyers were stapled to telephone poles. Officers questioned every night worker, every driver, even the man who sold Harold his newspapers each morning. But the trail was cold before it ever began. The snow had buried whatever traces he left behind, and the wind had carried away the rest. By mid-January, the police had nothing but a void where a man used to be, a man who vanished into the dark like he was never there at all. By the time February rolled around, the case felt like a door nailed shut. The initial frenzy was gone, replaced by a strange stillness that settled over the town like a heavy curtain. Leads had dried up. Every promising tip dissolved into nothing. Every theory, no matter how wild, ended in the same dead-end silence. Detectives returned to the factory more than once, scouring every corner again as if Harold might have been hiding in plain sight all along. They went through old attendance logs, payroll sheets, even Harold's letters and receipts, but nothing spoke. No hidden note, no sign of secret plans. The neatness of his life, once comforting, now felt like a cruel joke. Margaret kept calling the sheriff's office every other day. Her voice was always the same, calm at first, then cracking at the edges. You must have something new, anything. But they didn't. And as the weeks dragged on, people stopped answering her with hope. Rumors had taken root by then, crawling through the town like vines no one could cut down. Some said Harold had walked away, maybe with another life waiting somewhere else. Others whispered darker things about debts or grudges or something hidden under all that ordinary goodness. But even the wildest stories couldn't explain one thing: why there wasn't a single trace, not a witness, not a word. It was like he had been erased. For the police, frustration turned into fatigue. Detectives sat in their cramped office under the hum of the radiator, staring at a map covered in red pins that led nowhere. Reports stacked up. Interviews blurred together. One officer later admitted he'd wake at night thinking of that empty driveway, the snow piled like a shroud around Harold's car. It was like looking at a grave, he said softly. By March, the search was scaled back. Volunteers stopped showing up. The flyers on telephone poles curled and yellowed under the winter sun. The river thawed, but no one came to drag it again. Life moved on the way it always does, even when it shouldn't, and yet, for those closest to Harold, time did not move. Margaret sat in his house for weeks, sleeping in his chair, listening for the sound of his key in the door. She couldn't leave, not while every shadow in the room felt like it might hold him. But each day brought only silence, the kind that grows heavier until it feels like a presence of its own. In the end, the case wasn't closed. It wasn't solved, it just stopped, not with answers but with exhaustion, and that somehow felt worse than anything else. Because when there's nothing left to chase, all you have are questions. Questions that echo in the dark long after everyone else has stopped listening, years turned into decades. The Benton textile factory closed its doors for good in the early 80s, its windows boarded, its machines sold for scrap. The building stood empty after that, a hulking shadow on the edge of town collecting dust and stories. Teenagers dared each other to break in at night, graffiti bloomed on the walls. But Harold Benton's name still floated through whispers like smoke no one could clear. People moved on, at least on the surface. Margaret sold his house eventually, though she left most of his things packed in boxes, as if afraid moving them would erase what little was left of she never remarried, she never stopped looking. Every Christmas she sent a card to his old address, even though she knew no one would read it. By the late 90s, Harold's disappearance had become a kind of local folklore, a ghost story for late nights. A cautionary tale for kids who thought small towns were too boring for secrets. There were books, a couple of badly written newspaper retrospectives, even a short piece on a true crime radio show. Each one asked the same questions, none had the answers. Then came the demolition order. The factory had become a hazard, rotting floors, collapsing beams. In the spring of this year, crews rolled in with hard hats and sledgehammers, ready to strip the old place down to steel and dust. Most of the offices were gutted in a day, but on the third morning, just after sunrise, foreman Jack Doyle found something he hadn't seen before. It was the wall, a single section of plaster behind the coat rack in the old payroll office, bulging like a blister. At first, Jack thought it was just water damage, but when his crowbar punched through the softened plaster, metal rang out underneath, a hollow sound. Something sealed away. The men crowded around as Jack pried the boards loose. Beneath the plaster, behind a frame of warped studs, was a door. A heavy steel door, scratched and streaked with rust. A combination lock, dull with age, clung to its center. No one said anything at first. They just stared, listening to the rain drip through the rafters above. Jack ran his hand over the metal, his breath fogging in the cold air. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. No one answered. The safe was taller than a man, its edges sunk deep into the brick, no markings, no label. Just the lock and the silence pressing around it like a second skin. Someone fetched a grinder. Sparks flew as steel met steel, the noise screaming through the hollow factory. It took nearly an hour before the lock gave way with a groan that sounded almost alive. When the door finally swung open, the men expected money. Or something worse. Instead, the safe was filled with paper, stacks of it, old payroll ledgers bound in cracked leather tied with faded twine. Receipts, employee rosters, envelopes yellowed with time, all of it dry, untouched by decades, preserved like the day it was sealed. At first it felt like a disappointment, just records, but then someone found the box, small, wooden. Wedged at the back behind the files, its lid secured with a tarnished brass clasp. Jack set it on the floor, his gloves trembling as he opened it. Inside were photographs, black and white faces staring back from the past, and something else. A key, long iron, cold as bone. Jack looked at the others, his voice low, tight with something none of them wanted to name. This wasn't supposed to be here. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside that old office it felt like a storm was just beginning. They took the photographs out one by one, laying them across the dusty concrete like fragments of another life. Faces stared up in grainy black and white, men in work coats, women with hair pinned high, kids with gap-toothed grins standing outside the factory gate. Most were labeled in careful handwriting along the edges, names curling in faded ink. But near the bottom of the pile was a picture that made Jack stop breathing. It showed a group of factory workers posing in the payroll office, the same room they were standing in now, but newer, brighter, alive. In the center, between two tall filing cabinets, stood a man with dark hair and a sharp suit. His smile was wide, but something in his eyes seemed almost guarded. Underneath, written in neat cursive, was a single name, Harold Benton, 1953. Jack stared at it for a long time, his gloves smudging the surface. He didn't know why, but the photograph felt heavier than paper should. Maybe it was the way Harold's hand rested on the safe behind him, fingers spread like he was claiming it, like he wanted the world to know it was his. Then there was the key, long, old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in antique shops or museum cases. No one spoke as Jack held it up, the metal catching the dim light filtering through the broken windows. It didn't match the safe they'd just opened. Whatever it unlocked, it was somewhere else. "Think there's another one of the crew muttered, his voice low, almost afraid to echo. Jack didn't answer, he just kept turning the key in his hand, feeling its weight, its coldness sinking into his skin. He didn't want to admit it, but something about the whole thing, the hidden safe, the sealed papers, Harold's smile frozen in that photograph, felt wrong. Like they had opened a door that should have stayed shut. They called the Historical Society first, then the police. By evening, the site was crawling with people, cameras flashing, questions flying. Reporters showed up before dark, sniffing around for a story that smelled older than the town itself. Jack gave statements, he told them everything. At least almost everything, because when no one was looking, he slipped the key into his jacket pocket. Not out of greed, but something else he couldn't name, a pull, a need to know what it belonged to. That night, long after the site cleared and the rain started again, Jack sat in his truck with the box on the passenger seat, the key heavy in his pal. Somewhere out there, he thought, was a lock waiting for this key, and whatever it opened, he wasn't sure he wanted to find out, but he knew he would. Because things like this don't let go, they stay with you, whispering in the dark until you follow where they lead, and Jack Doyle. He was already listening. The rain kept falling through the night, steady and cold, turning the empty streets into ribbons of black glass. Jack drove without knowing where he was headed, his wipers cut back and forth like a metronome, keeping time with the pounding in his chest. The key sat on the seat beside him, its iron teeth catching the glow of the dashboard light every time the truck jolted over a pothole. He tried to tell himself it was just curiosity, that was all, nothing more, but deep down Jack knew that wasn't true. Ever since the safe cracked open, something had been gnawing at him. Not just the mystery, something heavier, something that felt personal, even though he'd never heard the name Harold Benton before yesterday. By the time he pulled into his driveway, it was nearly midnight. The little house sat quiet under the rain, the porch light throwing pale circles on the wet ground. Jack killed the engine and just sat there staring at the box on the passenger seat, his fingers tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. He should take it inside, put it somewhere safe, call the cops in the morning, do the right thing, but then his eyes drifted back to the key. That long, iron shaft, the way it seemed older than the factory itself, he picked it up slowly, feeling its weight settle into his palm again. It wasn't like any key he'd seen before, it didn't belong to a filing cabinet or a desk, it belonged to something old, something important. Jack carried the box inside, locking the door behind him. The house felt too quiet, like it was listening. He set the photographs out on the kitchen table, spreading them in neat rows under the weak glow of a single bulb. The workers' faces stared back, frozen smiles from a world long gone. And there was Harold again, that sharp suit, that guarded grin, the safe behind him like a silent promise. Jack leaned closer, tracing the edge of the photograph with his thumb. Then he saw it, barely noticeable at first. In the corner of the picture, behind Harold's shoulder, there was a door, narrow, half-shadowed, almost blending into the wall. And above it, nailed to the frame, a small brass plate. The letters were blurry, but Jack could make out enough to know what it said: basement. Jack sat back in his chair, heart pounding. The factory had a basement. He walked that place for days during the demolition prep and never saw any stairs leading down, no door, no sign of one at all, but it was there once. And maybe it still was, hidden like the safe, waiting. He looked at the key again, turning it over in his hand. His reflection stared back in the black window, rain streaking down like tears. He knew what he had to do, and he knew he'd do it alone. The next morning broke gray and heavy, clouds sagging low over the rooftops. Jack hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in a chair by the kitchen table, staring at those photographs until his eyes burned. Every time he closed them, he saw the same thing: the door in the picture, the brass plate, the shadow behind Harold's shoulder. By dawn he made up his mind. He filled a thermos with coffee, grabbed a flashlight and slipped the key into his pocket like a secret he couldn't share. The town was quiet when he drove out, streets slick from last night's rain, the factory looming in the distance like a dark skeleton against the sky. When Jack parked by the chain-link fence, the place felt even emptier than before. No workers, no noise, just the wind rattling loose sheets of metal and the distant groan of a crane left idle. He cut through a gap in the fence and crossed the yard, boots crunching over broken glass and gravel. Every step echoed louder than it should, like the factory was holding its breath. Inside, the air smelled of rust and damp concrete. Jack's flashlight swept across bare walls, stacks of old pallets, a few forgotten tools scattered like bones. He moved toward the payroll office, his pulse quickening with every stride. When he reached the room, nothing had changed: the open safe, the empty drawers, the dust swirling in the cold light, but Jack wasn't here for that. He was here for the door. He pulled out the photograph, holding it up against the wall like a map. The angle was tricky, but he found the spot, a stretch of plaster between two steel beams patched over long ago. Jack ran his hand across it. It felt solid, but when he knocked, the sound came back hollow. His chest tightened. Jack grabbed a crowbar from the pile of tools and went to work. The plaster cracked first, then chunks fell away, revealing rotted wood beneath. Sweat rolled down his back, mixing with the dust in the air. He kept prying, tearing, ripping until finally a seam appeared, a doorframe, and inside it, a door that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The handle was gone, but the lock was still there, old, iron, waiting. Jack pulled the key from his pocket with shaking hands. It slid in like it had been there all along. For a second he just stood there, listening to his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. Then he turned the key, the lock clicked. The sound was soft, but in the silence it felt like a gunshot. Jack pulled the door open. A wave of stale, cold air rolled out, smelling of earth and time. Beyond the threshold, a staircase descended into blackness, steep and narrow, vanishing into a place no one had walked in half a century. He lifted the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark like a blade. Dust spiraled in the light, slow and heavy. Jack hesitated at the top step, gripping the doorframe until his knuckles ached. Then he started down one step, then another. The door creaked shut behind him with a low groan, sealing out the gray daylight. And in that moment, Jack knew, whatever waited down there, it wasn't meant to be found. Some doors should never be opened, yet curiosity has a way of pulling us past the point of no return. What Jack found in that hidden room may never make the evening news, but it will echo in the empty halls of that factory forever. Ledger books, secret payments, a life that vanished into silence, pieces of a puzzle that will never fit cleanly together. And maybe that's the most haunting part: there are still questions hanging in the air, still shadows clinging to the edges of the story. Where did Harold go? Who was he protecting? And what price was paid to keep those names hidden in the dark? If this story kept you thinking, if you felt that chill running down your spine like I did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more mysteries, and share this with someone who loves a good cold case. The past doesn't always stay buried. Sometimes it's waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to dig it up. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your doors locked.